My name is Jennifer Dotson. I am the founder and program coordinator for Highland Park Poetry, and I'm very pleased to welcome James Reiss to our program today, Poetry Today. I'm honored, actually, to be with this poet. Jim grew up in New York City and northern New Jersey. For many years, he was professor of English at Miami University in Ohio, as well as the founding editor of Miami University Press. He's the author of several collections of poetry, including The Breathers, 10,000 Good Mornings, and Riff on Six, new and selected poems. His newest collection is the novel, published by CW Books of Cincinnati, and it's scheduled for release in January of 2015. He is also the editor of Self-Interviews, James Dickey. His work has appeared in such places as The Atlantic, Esquire, The New Yorker, you're going to get bored, The New Republic, The New York Times, The Paris Review, Poetry Slate, that's just to mention a few, plus the Kenyon Review and the Virginia Quarterly Review. Then there are many grants and awards. Again, too many accomplishments to mention, though I do need to mention my favorite one is the Zeitfunk Award. I just wanted to be able to say on camera, Zeitfunk, because I like the name. That is hysterical. Wow, I do feel like I'm in the presence of poetry royalty. Being with you.
Well, who needs a Pulitzer Prize when you can get a Zeitfunk?
Exactly.
Thanks for pronouncing it.
What is a Zeitfunk?
I did some reviews, extensive reviewing for PRX, which is a Boston outfit that does, or Cambridge, Mass, that does reviews, or deals with independent NPR type videos and actually it's radio stations, independent radio. It's been a while since I've done this, so I'm kind of rusty on it.
Oh, okay.
And I did something like close to 300 reviews just of their programs over 3 years, and I won awards year after year.
Wow.
Thanks for
caring.
So
you're the king of the Zeitfunk. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Well, one of the reasons that we decided to schedule this conversation was the publication of your newest collection, the novel. And I guess since you've published so many books, what was unique about this particular one?
Just that I'm continuing to do it anymore, and that I have continued really in almost with almost no incentives except a sort of self-starter passion that I have in me to continue. The poems, I mean, I don't want to really say how this book is different from, but I'm not a young guy anymore, as you can see. I'm 147 years old, quickly fading now to 193 in another minute or so.
Right.
So just the fact that I'm doing something at my advanced stage is, I guess, is something.
Well, what was this? Is this a new publisher that you've worked with?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did they approach you, or was
Well, I approached them.
Okay.
I had approached a variety of publishers, and they took me.
Oh,
about a year ago,
okay.
They took me, and I haven't had the good fortune, like some of my colleagues, to have a single publishing house continue to be my publisher for my entire career. So I've changed from Echo Press to Pittsburgh Press, University of Pittsburgh Press, to Carnegie Mellon University Press, to Salt Publishing, which is a British outfit, actually.
Ooh,
and now I've come back to the United States to roost here.
Well, now, that's interesting that you were the founder of the Miami Press.
That's right. That's right.
So having sat on both sides of the desk, I don't know, what did you feel about working with this new publisher for you?
Oh, it's good. And these people, it's always exciting to have a new editor. This is more of a hands-on editor who's willing to try things with me than previous people at Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon. I really didn't have much of a feeling for the in-house editors. And in this case, it's It's more of a warm personal relationship.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's wonderful.
Although I've never set eyes on him, it's simply
all by-
personal.
all by
you
email.
know, all by
Yes.
cyberspace. That's
Okay,
right.
right.
That's where we are nowadays. Yeah.
Well, it does make it convenient that you can then work with someone in a completely different city.
Yeah.
And you don't have to travel to get the project done.
Right.
How long did this particular process, for this, the publication from their acceptance of your manuscript to
Let's see. Yeah.
now?
I think they took the book either last February or last March 2014, I mean. And so it's a good part of a year. The book's coming out in, as we mentioned, in January. I already have some advanced copies here. So a good part of a year, 10 months, something like that. Of course, it took me 12 years since, which is a long time,
Okay.
even longer than Donna Tartt took to write her great novel, The Goldfinch, which was 10 years. This was an unusually long period.
You felt the
wait.
clock was ticking.
The clock, the biological clock, the whole, the heart is, I might kick off right in the middle of this
No, don't.
program, too.
Please don't.
I think it might be a first for all of us here.
Well, since we're talking about the novel, why don't you share with us a poem from the book?
I thought I'd start with a poem about my aunt, who was kind of a surrogate mother. This is sort of light verse, folks, in case you want to know. And it's not 14,000 lines. I'm not going to be reading you Paradise Lost here. It's all of 8 rhyming lines, and it's for a woman who, other than my mother, meant the most to me. I have a whole bunch of poems, some of which, a small number of which I published in books during my career and in magazines too, but many more in draft form in my folders. This is, I use the word doggerel to describe this, which means wretched verse, really bad verse. So I'm sort of self-deprecating here, my humor about this. And I hope you see it as a humorous poem. Doggerel for Mrs. Brenda Marks. Methinks that neither nightingales nor larks sing wondrously as Mrs. Brenda Marks. She yodels, bingo, P.S., give 'em hell. She loudens like Bolero by Ravel. She looks like Doris Day, she ad-libs. Her nickname titillates my tongue. It's Bibbs. My mom deserves high compliments, but can't compare with Mrs. Brenda Marks, my aunt. That's it in a nutshell. Yeah, unfortunately, she is no longer willingly with us, as Dylan Thomas would say. She died in 2011, and this is one of the poems I wasn't able to obviously read her or share with her.
Wow.
We were so close. She outlived my own mother by quite a few years, and I visited her often and with lots of love. Thanks.
Wow,
Any
no,
questions? Or
I-
this is tough stuff to follow. I know it's very obscure. The hidden meaning here is, what does it mean, folks? What does it mean?
Well, read another one then.
Okay, well, I thought I'd start out with some rhyming poems. At the back of the book, I have a bunch of poems that are in traditional forms. Some of them rhyme, some are haikus that look like sonnets and so forth. Well, this one is one of the oldest poems in the book. I wrote it almost exactly 50 years ago on my honeymoon with my now former wife in 1964. We had been on an extended honeymoon, way too long in Europe, and we were just so fed up and jaded with tourist hotspots in Europe, from England and Ireland through Germany and Italy and back to France, that by the time we came to our departure city to leave Europe in Paris, we just hunkered down in our hotel room, and Barbara did some sketches. She was, among other things, a visual artist, and I wrote this poem about her. And she grew up in Highland Park, of all places.
How perfect.
She went to Highland Park High School, all the grade schools and everything. She's a Highland Park product near Lincoln and Linden, I think, if I remember right. And she's writing about, or I'm writing about, a particular horse chestnut tree in her backyard, which I think we tried to find at a certain point, and we couldn't, because Jennifer Dotson was interested in this, in the roots or the origin of this poem too. Here's a poem which is based on a real story about my former wife as a little girl. Barbara is beautiful. The world is free. The ripe horse chestnuts in her hands shone like mahogany. She polished them until her face was mirrored perfectly. She put them in a jewelry box and hid the box away and saved them for somebody else some other day. But when at last she opened it and saw the chestnut skins no longer were mahogany or mirrored her like twins, she held the wrinkled shells up high and cast them at the tree and said that she was beautiful and that the world was free. Well, I was so glad that I was able to go back to that. There's one poem in this book that's even older than that. I wrote in 1962, which is 52 years ago from this date we're recording, and I think it still has some value. This was this is the second poem the New York Times bought from me. They bought my first poem in 1962 when I was barely 20, but this came out, I think, in 1965. I wrote it in 64. Thanks for listening. I heard you I saw you put in your earplugs. The camera wasn't on you, but still, I could see it.
Not on your life. Not on your life. Well, no, the Barbara is beautiful, the world is free poem. We Highland Park Poetry did a feature on our Muses Gallery a couple years ago.
You did.
Featuring poems about Highland Park, or Highland Park was the theme of all the poems, and so you submitted that one. That was like one of the featured ones on that website.
Yes, I remember. Yes.
So, wow, I'm honored that we've.
Yeah. I think that Barbara tells me, and I'm on good terms with her, that the tree is still there.
Oh my
it's
goodness!
Still,
okay.
Trees live a long time.
Yes.
But anyway, you have to believe that.
Well, you definitely seem very comfortable with verse. Rhyming verse, I guess what I was saying, as well as other, the free verse. And do you have a favorite, or?
Well, one of my rhyming verse tours de force, you could say, or virtuoso pieces, is a 90-line poem. I'm not going to read it, about Edmund Spenser, the great 16th century poet, Elizabethan poet, right before Shakespeare, who wrote The Faerie Queen, many thousands of lines about Queen Elizabeth. It's an allegory, a great poem. I've always loved it, and especially the first two books. And I wrote my poem in Spenserian stanzas, which is an intricate rhyming form. I don't think anybody has tried to do that, certainly in my generation.
Wow. Keats
used Spenserian stanzas, so didn't Shelley and Adonais, and I think Tennyson did too. But in this century, much less the 20th century, I think most poets, American and British poets, have stayed away from the Spenserian stanza.
They're afraid.
Yeah,
They're
it's
afraid.
daunting. But I loved it. To me, it was a great challenge, and I had visited, when I was in Ireland, I had visited a place where Spenser was said to have begun work on the Faerie Queen with Sir Walter Raleigh, who was his close friend at that point. And I felt like one of the group. And, now you're one of the group too. Raleigh, Spenser.
Well, okay, you seem to pull inspiration from all over.
Yeah, I do.
What's inspiring you now? I mean, you're still writing, so what do you do?
Well, it's not every day, and I live an ordinary life too, and I get not bored. So I know I don't get bored, but I'm in what Wallace Stevens called the malady of the quotidian. That is to say, I suffer from the malady of the quotidian. Every day, getting up and going to bed and eating meals And most of it isn't these transcendent moments by any means. It's just getting through the day, especially at my age, and going to the gym and trying to prove that I'm still alive and kicking, whatever, karate kicking or something like that.
So you say you don't write every day. So I mean,
no.
And do you?
No.
I don't know. Like
Far from it.
Like a professional athlete might have a lucky pair of socks. Do you have any superstitions or special stuff to get your poetry mojo going? Or
who was it? Some French poet who had the smell of rotten apples in his desk was what set him off. Was it Stephen Mallarmé? I think it might have been. But no, I don't have any. I do still go to the desk and try to write every day in my journal.
Okay.
And sometimes that produces something, but more often it produces the kind of stock line that I make fun of. I sit here flicking lint. I'm just, participating in life and trying to observe, trying to be productive. I mean, I do keep at it, but
that's good.
I could write a poem a day, but it would just be crap. I mean, I'm sorry for the bad word, 4-letter word.
Okay, well, what is your favorite part about being a poet?
Well, having finished a poem, Jen, having finished a poem is, especially one that I feel good about. Having birthed a child, I think, for instance, when I wrote Barbara's Beautiful, The World is Free, I was so elated for days, and we went back to New York, where my parents were living at the time, and I couldn't wait to read them that poem about Barbara and the horse chestnut tree. There's not $1 million in that, far from it, but that's the way I felt, like $1 million. That's the biggest gift that I feel, the biggest high.
How do you know a poem is finished? I mean, is it just the initial writing that's the most euphoric, or is it? I mean, do you go back and tweak and poke and?
So all the time, I'm tweaking, and I don't know how many drafts Barbara's Beautiful or the Bibbs poem that Mrs. Brenda Marks cost me, but I've spent hundreds of drafts on certain breakthrough poems, or poems that are not even breakthroughs, that just go through all of that. But it's the light at the end of the tunnel, the thought, keeping on working and working until you go against Paul Valéry's statement that one never finishes the poem, one abandons it.
Okay.
He actually said one abandons it in despair. But I get beyond that point. I bring it to some kind of closure, you could say.
Oh, that's good.
But often I'm revising in my selected poems. I've blacked out certain words and changed them, even in print.
Okay.
I'm not the only one who's done this. I mean, I think I've gone through. T.S. Eliot did this too. I just followed his doing this. And Wallace Stevens did it all the time. All the great poets of the 20th century, and you know what, Shakespeare. I mean, those folios, those quartos and folios were in a constant state of revision. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So it never stops, that kind of thing.
Well, you've mentioned a whole bunch of poets. I was going to ask if you have any poets that you particularly admire, or, which is a kind of a regular question. A lot of people probably have asked you that question. I was wondering, any poets that intimidate you?
I feel a reverence for John Milton, for instance. I could recite some lines of Milton to give you the real flavor of him, but I won't. But I don't think I feel intimidated. I worship the guy. I mean, if you care about the Buddha or Jesus, or do they intimidate you? These are such heroes for me, or heroines like Emily Dickinson or Elizabeth Bishop. It's not just the man. It's a poem like I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, which uses the great synesthesia you were interested in her final stanza, or Elizabeth Bishop's poem The Fish, or her Villanelle One Art. I mean, this is not intimidating. It's supremely satisfying and, worshipful, I feel.
Now, you still just continue to read and revisit these poets a lot? Or
and
I mean, at
new
this
ones.
point, there seem to be part of your consciousness, the fact that you can recite them.
Oh, I can, yeah. But I
know.
didn't even sit down to learn them. I just one day came out and you said, "Him, the almighty power, hurled headlong flaming from the ethereal sky with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition, there to dwell in adamantine chains and penal fire, who durst defy the omnipotent to arms." Now, who wrote that?
Oh my gosh.
That's Milton. See, that's
Okay.
Paradise Lost.
Okay.
And that
All right.
tremendous wedding cake of, or whatever you want to call it, of language. I mean, we have even Barack Obama, and I'm a fan, is a great speaker, but I mean, how he uses the language is nothing. How any of us, how I'm using it now, or you,
Right.
or anybody around here, is nothing compared to that. So, what? That's not intimidating, though. That's
Well, it's interesting,
It's
though.
great.
In one of the reviews I saw listed on the promotional book sheet for it said plain-spoken poet.
yes,
And,
I'm in that
do you-
tradition.
okay.
Yeah.
What does that? I mean, what does that mean? So
It means
is
the
that
language of everyday
accessible,
speech,
or-
accessible, so that the guy on the street can understand me, even though that poem about Spenser's Fairy Queen is not the poem that's accessible
Okay.
to your guy on the street. No, I write that kind of thing too, but
Right.
I can do that. But I made my whatever reputation I have with the New York Times book review or Helen Vendler at Harvard has to do with my sort of everyday speech.
Okay.
You know, lines like, "In Ohio, where these things happen, we had been loving all winter," at the beginning of an elegy for my son.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's easy. You don't have to, unless you don't know where Ohio is. And half the time I don't either.
Okay.
I'm losing it, kid. I'm losing it. Save me.
Well, the other thing you've taught poetry for many, many years, and obviously, so you're, having this wealth of knowledge of poetic history and
Yeah.
at your fingertips is probably an essential tool as a professor.
Yeah.
But did you have sort of, top 10 tips that you would give to new poets or poets who are just at the beginning of thinking about, I've been working on this poem and I'd like to send it to a journal or maybe read it at an open mic. What do you say?
Well, one of the things, but it's the old stock advice that gets to be so cliched after a while, like write what you know, but that's what Shakespeare knew everything, and I don't know what a guy. Maybe it was 10 people, who knows? Or read Shakespeare, or read the Romantics. There are some people in the studio who are profound aficionadas, as a woman, of the Romantic poets, or try not to have too many abstract nouns like happiness, fear, in the writing, but try to use imagery or other ways of talking about a variety of feelings and thoughts, rather than using the word feelings and "I am feeling bad." That's not a good line at all. But if you say, "When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes," I mean, that's the beginning of the 29th Psalm. It's one of Shakespeare's psalms, of sonnets. The same thing, the Psalms, the sonnets. The Psalms are certainly poetry too. So that is poetry, and it uses the word disgrace too, and fortune, but somehow manages to have some life with the men's eyes. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, he means by that his reputation, how men look at him and so on, how people view him, his rep. He had a bad rep at a certain way, he felt. And playwrights and poets have always had bad reps by people who are engineers or people who go down, lawyers, doctors, in the more calm and pacific professions, one could say. So anyway, those are some of the tidbits I have. But little prompts about getting down and writing, for instance, a poem about your very first memory, if you can remember that, or write a letter to one of your parents explaining your anger with them, let's say, even if you love them, there might be some anger. Or try to imagine your father's clothes closet and describe 3 or 4 things in your father's clothes closet when you were, let's say, 5 or 6 or something like that, to get yourself back into the smell of the clothes closet and who your father really was. Not to say just, my father was a great man, or I loved my father, but to describe what kind of clothes he had.
So getting like real details and
Detail.
concrete, yeah.
Yeah, detail.
That we can, that the
Particular
reader or the audience can impart some of the feeling behind it without you saying the feeling.
Right, and you know this because
okay.
I've read your poems. Your poems are loaded with particulars at the same time as they also point to in universal directions too. So you know this, but a lot of beginning writers don't. They don't know how to muster particular specific details and write with the senses, not just the eyes and the ears, but the nose and, the
All
other.
I'm thinking right now that you said that prompt about your father's clothes closet, I'm saying shoe tree. Isn't that the word for that thing that you would?
It is.
It was like that wooden contraption that you would stick inside the shoes to keep them.
Exactly.
I don't know, perfect and whatever. I remember being fascinated by the shoe tree.
Yes, you got it.
Well, you also seem to have a love of words and language and playing with them.
Yes.
And I think I asked you in beforehand if there was a moment of epiphany where you just sort of, wow, I do want to be a poet. And
no, it's always been a lover's quarrel with poetry, although I was completely obsessed, as I mentioned to you. It's been an obsession from day one, or at least when I was age 8. I just kept on rhyming words and playing word games, sometimes with my mother, who was a frustrated writer, sometimes with my father, who would read my early drafts and had sort of an unconditional positive regard, a wonderful praise that I didn't quite get from my mother, who was more mixed in her critical appreciation of my work. But there never was one time that I can sit down and say, I want to be a poet. And maybe that's because I'm a second child, and my big brother was a poet too, an Israeli poet who wrote in Hebrew. He's no longer alive, alas.
Wow.
He gave me a lot of guff. And so I had this kind of, whether it was modesty or an inferiority complex, I never really thought of myself as a poet.
Wow.
I did it though. I never stopped. I mean, I stopped for the ordinary life events, and some that were extraordinary too. You stop for a while, but I kept on going back to it. I was hooked, like drugs or sex or something like that.
Well, it will definitely be a wonderful evening when we get you at the Art Center. Jim's going to be our featured guest poet on Friday, February 13th at 8 p.m. at the Art Center of Highland Park, which is located at 1957 Sheridan Road. The event is free, and it's open to the public, and there will also be an open mic after the reading, and poets are welcome to bring up to 6 poems to share, and it should be an exciting evening, and of course you'll have books available at that time, we hope, knock on wood.
Yes,
right,
yes.
Right.
But it'll be Friday the 13th too.
Oh, right. Oh, yes.
The dark side of Friday. No, come, folks, come. Don't stop coming because of that.
Because I was going to ask you if we had time to read one more poem.
Sure.
Did you have
yeah, I've got one.
Maybe the Bureau of Missing Persons?
Oh, do you want that? I think that might be a little bit of a down. Squeezebox strikes me as being a little bit more of an upbeat poem, an Atlantic Monthly poem that I really love.
Here.
It's on page 20.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
Right.
All right.
I've got it. Let me get these out of the way here so I can read this. Squeezebox. You stretched its bellows to the limit without ripping the fabric. So what if you weren't the guy on TV who touched off tremolos by twitching his instrument in time with Ed Sullivan's hand claps? You pumped yours like a concertina, tight in your shoulder straps, pounding the keyboard. You took lessons from Mr. Marino, who called your accordion an axe. He taught you jazz syncopations, scales you muffed, and once, while he stood behind you fingering your ribs, the rhythm of a man in love with boys. So what if you weren't the crush he imagined performing in pigeon piazzas where tourists noshed on prosciutto? Flawless from his tap shoes to his toupee as he played Sorrento and Lady of Spain.